Hello and welcome to Show and Tell. I'm David PERELL with Ana Lorena Fabrega, and today we are going to be talking about why Y-Combinator, which is a Silicon Valley accelerator, is one of the most important education companies in the world. And I kid you not, Ana and I have spent all week talking about Y-Combinator, and we fundamentally think that they figured out certain things around project-based learning, that they've figured out certain things about community, about networks, about what it means to raise people's ambitions, and ultimately what it means to teach people in the 21st century. So a little bit about Y-Combinator. Y-Combinator is...
Can we talk about this later? I really want to see your show and tell item.
But I have to finish.
Okay, okay, fine. Finish briefly.
Okay, 1 second. So, Y-Combinator is a startup accelerator. Okay, fine. You're really excited.
Okay.
We're going straight to show and tell.
That part. Yes.
We're going straight to show and tell. So, I brought 2 items today, and they are Terracotta Warriors. Do you know about the Terracotta Warriors?
No, but I'm excited for the explanation.
Okay, I got these when I went to China in 2007. We went to a place called Xi'an. And Xi'an is in the middle of the country, a little bit north. And basically, in the 1970s, these archaeologists discovered that there were 7,000 of these warriors. And they're all made out of terracotta clay, which is why they're called the Terracotta Warriors. And then they all have different shapes and represent different class hierarchies and stuff like that, and different functions in the military. And I think that what's crazy about it is the sheer scale of it. And I think that it's a really good example of what Y-Combinator is in terms of what humans can do when they have just bold visions for things, and just the fact that you can create something that people wouldn't even dream of. Like, this would all happen before Christ, and they made these incredible statues that lasted the test of time. And I think that that's a lot of what Y-Combinator is actually trying to do with the companies that they're trying to build. They're trying to build companies that are influential for many years, and they're trying to raise ambitions. Like when the emperor of China said, "Oh, let's go build these terracotta warriors," I bet people thought it was a crazy idea. And I think that that is deeply steeped in the Y-Combinator ethos. Okay, I want to know what yours is.
So cool. I can't believe we have 2 out of all those. That's pretty cool.
Well, these aren't the real ones, I wish.
Oh,
the real
I
ones are
the
life
real
size.
ones.
The real ones are life size, like as big as us. These are little.
Okay, it's still cool, but it would have been way cooler if you
It would have been
2.
way cooler. But if I had the real ones, then we wouldn't have to do this show, because I would just sell them and I'd be worth $1 trillion.
I love that. Okay, so my show and tell item, since we're talking about what Y-Combinator tells us about education and the way that they do things in YC, so I've learned this week, is that it's very hands-on and very project-based and student-centered. So I decided that for show and tell today, I would be sharing 2 of the projects that our campers did during the pilot program of our summer camp. So for those of you that don't know this, but David and I run this creative online school for kids to explore and develop their ideas, and for them to collaborate and come up with projects that they really care about, which is kind of like the kid version of what they're doing at Y-Combinator. And it's a place where kids can really be the directors and managers of their learning. And we ran a pilot program that lasted a week to test our ideas, and especially about project-based learning. And kids just really quickly had to identify the problem that they really felt passionate about. They had to brainstorm some ideas to solve that problem, and then turn those ideas into projects that they presented at the end, right? So it was in 5 days. So they really have, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but they had the opportunity to tinker and really follow their curiosities and work in teams. So let's see.
Show me. Anna's not very good with technology, everybody.
How dare you?
Share
screen. Boom. All right, so this is our process that we went through in that week, where kids found a problem, they identified their passions, they brainstormed an idea, they made a project, and then they had to share. So they came up with a bunch of different problems that we call the watermelon problems. And then they came up with what we call the unicorn ideas, which is when they match one of their passions with a really good idea to solve that problem. And the two that I'm going to share today is one is from this girl called Mia, and she made a newsletter about stray dogs. So again, they had 1 week, and her problem that was really bothering her was that there are about 200 million stray dogs in the world, and they're exposed to, really extreme life conditions. And Mia is obsessed with dogs. She has 8 dogs of her own, and with her mom, she loves to be a dog rescuer. But she was trying to find a way for more kids to kind of like get on board this idea and to raise awareness. So she mixed it with one of her interests. She's a really good writer. And so she decided to create a newsletter directed to kids in order to raise awareness of stray dogs in this place called Veracruz in Panama. And the other project that I'm going to share is one made by another girl called Maya. And she made a kid-safe steam cooker, like the design of one. So the problem that she was really thinking about that week was that there are not enough cooking tools that are safe for kids who like to cook like her. And that she felt like kids were really dependent on adults for cooking. So she came up with the idea, she loves to draw and she loves engineering. So she said that she wanted to design this one, all-in-one kid-safe steam cooker where kids could independently cook, and she would combine everything she knows about cooking and engineering and design it in paper. And then she said after in the last day that she wanted to come back to summer camp and turn that design into a cardboard prototype for a second test. So I love how they're already thinking, okay, well, what am I going to do with this idea? And again, this was in a really short period of time, and kids came up with things like this. So
tell me, how does that relate to Y-Combinator? I think it's really cool that the project-based learning curriculum that you came up with is so much like Y-Combinator. But tell me, what is it, as you've been studying Y-Combinator, what has stuck out to you in terms of your philosophy of teaching?
So one of my strongest beliefs, and you and I actually share this, is that knowledge is not something that can just be delivered to kids, right? But rather something that it needs to be constructed by them. And I say this not only because there are many theories out there and approaches that talk about this and, progressive education, but also because I actually lived this as a teacher with my kids, right? I tried everything you can imagine to kind of help my kids absorb everything that I was teaching them. I would be funny. I would try to make it fun. I would try to find examples that resonated with them, but really, in the end, very little stuck with them. So I realized that this is because kids really learn by doing, and they really need to be engaged and actively involved in their learning. And they understand things better when they're creating and inventing, which is why I'm a big advocate of learning through making and this idea of, project-based learning. And it turns out that in Y-Combinator, they really understand this well, and they understand that people are most productive when they spend most of their time building and creating things. So what they've done at Y-Combinator is that they've created an environment where the founders, which are the people that go there, can focus exclusively on building products and talking to users. And it's very hands-on, it's very project-based, and it's very, again, student-centered. So Y-Combinator is like the real-life example of project-based learning that we've been talking about, right? So I've seen it in a kid context, and it's just been so interesting to finally see it in the adult version, right, in the real world. And many of the ideals that they talk about are embedded in our beliefs of what it is like to learn and what's the best way for kids to learn. And we can go into detail, but there are many things that they're doing right that resemble what maybe teachers should be doing with kids and what the process should look like in schools.
I feel like one of the things that you're hitting on here that Y-Combinator really gets right is that we think of teaching as as if teaching mirrors television. The way that you watch television is you sit back and then there's something there to kind of entertain you, and there is a teacher just delivering the information, and it is your job to sit there and soak up that information. And depending on how well you regurgitate that information, that then equals how much you actually learned. And Y-Combinator is a very different model of education, which I think is similar to yours, which is basically saying a teacher's job is not to give information to the students, but rather to create an environment where a student can then teach themselves. But you don't want no hands-on, because it's sort of like bowling. You want some bumpers on the lane so that they can go pow, 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 pow. Actually, that's a lot like our partnership. You are a raging ball of hurricane madness, and it is my job to basically say, Anna, stop doing that, do more of this. Anyway,
That is a
Anyway,
great example. But I guess it's not true.
so anyway, it's a very different model of learning where they're basically saying, go, come in, do whatever you want, and we are going to meet once a week. They have one weekly dinner. And then they basically say, look, we're giving you the money and the finances to fund yourself to move out to Silicon Valley to live for 3 months while you work nonstop on your company. And beyond that, we're here to help, but you can do whatever you want, provided it accelerates the growth of your startup. And I think that you could see the same metaphor there. You can do whatever you want, provided that it is in service of your project.
Yes. And you know what? Going back to that question that you asked me, how does it relate to what we're doing in summer camp? Well, one of the things that, that drove them in starting Y-Combinator was the belief that if they helped founders in the earlier stages, then there could be a lot more successful startups. What we believe, obviously, that resonated, right, is that if we help kids start creating things that they are proud of and that they're passionate about and creating things that people actually want from an earlier stage, then we're going to have a lot more creations made by kids, right? And we're going to start changing their perception of learning. I love how they talk about the culture of high expectations and setting really ambitious goals, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. When people come into Y-Combinator, they have meetings and they set their goals and expectations, and other people are always raising those goals, saying, you can do more, you can do more, you can do more. And what people find, at least the people I've spoken to, is by raising their goals, even if they don't achieve the new goal, they often end up achieving more than they originally thought they could based on their first goal.
And it's this idea that you can't make people do something that they don't want to do, and you cannot force learning into kids. You cannot force this. But if you create the right conditions, then you can bring out the best in them, right? And since people, for example, the founders, when they get there, they have way more potential than they realize, and they're often surprised with what they're capable of doing when, they're asked to raise their expectations and their ambitions. And it's the same thing that we see with kids, right? And I have so many examples of summer camp when day 2, the kids are like, I'm done. I'm like, are you really done? Okay, let me ask you, what's version 2 of the product that you're doing? Or if I were to criticize something of your project, what would it be? And automatically they knew what to do. They would go back and they would start working again. And then suddenly I'm like, well, weren't you done? And they're like, no, actually I need to do this and this and this and that. So it's, again, this idea that the role of, and we can talk about, the role of the investors, since it's really similar to the role that a teacher should have in the learning experience of kids, is to push you and encourage you, but really make sure that you are, meeting or exceeding your own expectations, right? Which is really interesting. I
really like what you said. Let's stay on this. I really like what you said about standards and high expectations, because I feel like a lot of teachers actually have low expectations of their students.
Here's the thing. It's again going to this idea that kids are just kids, right? And we have this idea because they are kids and they're not adults, they can just do this and this and this. But what I've noticed, and that's why I love hanging out with kids so much, is that they will, if you let them and if you treat them like adults and if you just don't put those parameters and in your head, it's like, oh, they're just a kid, they will do it. And they will often do things better than you thought, better than they thought. So it's a matter of stop thinking of them as kids and just let them and give them the chance. And you know what? If they fail, that's fine. They can try again. Or if they need help, you can go and support them. But the thing is, teachers have low expectations of kids because it's really hard for them to step back and see what happens. They are so tempted to just intervene and then solve the problem. Because when they see a kid struggling, immediately they intervene. It's like, no, let them struggle. Let them figure it out. If you give them the time and the space, they will figure it out. Remember that example that I posted a few weeks ago, or I think it was last week, of these kids in villages in Africa where they were illiterate. They had never seen written text before. And they just dumped these boxes of Android laptops. And in matter of 4 minutes, a kid had already figured out how to turn it on. In a few weeks, they were singing the ABCs in the village. After 5 months, they had hacked Android. These are kids that had never ever seen written text before. They had no teacher, no textbook, no anything. What they had were the resources, they had access, they had time, and they had space to explore. And look what they came up with. These were first graders, by the way. So what I'm trying to say is when teachers have low expectation of kids, it's because they haven't given them the chance yet. So I'm not saying like raise the expectations to the point where, they are not encouraged to do things, but just trust them more and let's see what happens when you give them the time, the space, and the resources.
Do you want to talk about the tests where everyone at Y-Combinator has to memorize what all the terms mean? They have to memorize safe notes. They have to memorize what fundraising is. I'm just kidding you.
I was like, I have not come across this part of the of the equation. That's too funny.
No, that's my point. Like, there is no memorization. Like, you don't come in and have to start memorizing. Like, doing a startup is different from memorizing what a term sheet is. It's different from memorizing what a safe note is. It's different from memorizing what CAC means, which is customer acquisition cost. Like, YC is saying, no, you actually learn that later by virtue of just needing to learn it by building your business. But like, the way to teach someone to build a startup is not to teach them all the key terms so that they sound smart when they talk to an investor. The whole point is to get them actually doing the thing, and then they will learn those. And it's sort of like what you see in school all the time, where like the logic goes like this, and it's very flawed. It's like, successful people know what the key terms mean. Therefore, we can train people to be successful by teaching them the key terms. That's actually not true at all. But like, that's the kind of logic that gets infected into the school system. And Y-Combinator is different. Like, yeah, there's like a very broad syllabus, but they're sort of like just the bowling lanes that we were talking about earlier. Really, what Y-Combinator does is it has a consistent structure that everybody goes through that's actually very similar now to what it was when it was created, however, like a decade ago. And then instead of following a syllabus, the founders are encouraged to just work on a passion project, which is just building their company. And then they learn the things that you would have to memorize later.
Well, that reminds me. So I was reading that there were kind of like two kinds of people that go to Y-Combinator. You have the academics, and then you have the hustlers. And that the academics view Y-Combinator as a startup school. So they show up, they sit down, and they follow the program. And their motto is kind of like, if I just told what I'm told, I'll graduate successfully. Does it sound familiar? It's pretty much what they teach you in school, right? So this approach works, right? Like Y-Combinator's design is to help you start a startup. But you learn a lot more if you take advantage of all the things that the program has to offer, right? Not just like following through, but just really trying to see like, okay, what am I missing? Who do I need to talk to? Where do I, what do I need to do in order to absorb everything that I need to from this program? And then the hustlers on the other side, they don't leave any source of potential value, like untapped, right? So they will recognize that YC is this like rich resource environment, and they need to take full responsibility of their learning. And their motto, unlike the academics, is like, we're here to make a business successful, and we're going to leverage every single resource that we can to make that happen. So the hustlers will learn, leverage, and then fail and keep going, and just kind of like see everything that's in the table that they can absorb, right? So you see the difference between an academic and a hustler. And in school, the kids that do really well and that are the successful ones are the academics. But in real life, when the academics, come to the real life, they're missing something, right? Like they don't end up absorbing everything from these experiences.
Want to hear a crazy story?
Always.
Be careful what you wish for. That's a bold answer. This story could be really bad. Okay, high expectations. I might botch it. So, I interviewed on my podcast a guy named Daniel Gross. And Daniel, when he was funded by Y-Combinator, was the youngest founder ever to be funded by them. And he grew up in Israel, and he must have been founded like 17, 18, or 19. So he comes in, and Daniel ended up being a partner at Y-Combinator years later. And so like he ran Y-Combinator. And so he comes in, and he goes through the program, and it's 2 days before demo day. And this will give you an idea of who's the school person and who's the hustler.
The academics and the hustlers.
And exactly, the academics and the hustlers. And so Paul Graham, he's having a conversation with Paul Graham 2 days before as I remember it. And he's just gets feedback like, your idea isn't good enough and it's not going to get funded. I actually think that there was some kind of thing with like trademark or some serious issue, and his product couldn't go into demo day. So he's got 48 hours before demo day and he's got to figure something out. So he goes code, figures it out, goes to demo day, gets an investment. 3-4 years later, that company is bought by Apple. He sells his company to Apple at like 24 years old for something like $40-50 million. Then works at Apple, goes back to Y-Combinator, becomes a partner there, not a founder. And then now he runs a company called Pioneer, which brings all of these young people together for a very different kind of project-based learning. But just an insane example of what it means to have that hacker, I just need to get it done mindset. And he's not thinking in the moment, what am I learning? What am I learning? Is this on the syllabus? Is this on the test? He's thinking, nope, I have a demo day. It matters. People are going to be watching at me, and I got to figure it out.
Which also talks about the role of the investors, right? Like how they've created a good combination between support and, a lot of support, but also like they push you. And so that accountability component is also key. So many people think, okay, if teachers are not there to teach and they're there to facilitate and to let the kids learn and this and that, what are the teachers doing? No, but the teacher's role is, in addition to creating the conditions of invention and providing the resources and the space and the support, they're also there to, keep you accountable. So that's something also that's also something that I really like about Y-Combinator, and that I think that many, more teachers should emulate this role that the investors have, which is they will offer advice, but they won't tell you what to do. So they try to interfere as little as possible in the startups that they fund. And that's what teachers should do. They should advise, but not interfere and not, take away the learning, right? And I was reading that they don't take board seats or many of those other powers that investors sometimes require, right? So they offer the advice, but they know that they can't force it into anyone. And they realized, I love this, they realized that independence is one of the reasons why people start startups in the first place, right? And that's why they try to really give all that independence. And just like kids want to be in charge of their learning. They want to conduct their learning. And when you let them do that, that's when you see them more engaged. And that's when you see them producing all these things that you otherwise wouldn't have seen if you try to control the whole learning process, right? So I was reading how they were saying investors who try to control the companies that they fund often end up destroying them. And it made me think, just like teachers who try to control the learning and control the students end up preventing learning from happening.
Wow, lots of really good points in there. One of the things that I was thinking about is just how learning can happen so much faster than you think, in that school sets a bar for average, and you end up either going down or going up to the average. But the problem is the average is generally sort of lower than the median of what every single person would do on their own. So if you had 20 people going on their own, the average person would go faster than if you got 20 people in a group and then took the average. Because when you get people in groups, people get slowed down, and the people at the back really hold somebody back. It's sort of like when you're in a group of 5 people, you don't rise to the person at the top, you fall to the person at the bottom. And so my point here is in saying a couple things. That, first of all, when it comes to college, people talk a lot about the cost of college, but not all the time that it takes to complete. Those are 4 years of your life. And don't get me wrong, they're fantastic, but depending on where you go and what you do, but at the same time, that's still half a decade of your life. And say that you wanted to go build something. I mean, many people in college don't get as much done or learn as much as people do in 3 months of Y-Combinator. And I think that there's a couple things here. That Y-Combinator, we're talking about the group phenomenon, has figured out how to have groups be this positive recurring feedback loop on ambition, where everyone comes together, is yeah, let's go. And everyone is charging each other up, supporting each other, helping each other up, so that everyone gets more ambitious. And so then you get this virtuous loop where rather than falling to the bottom, you get people rising to the top. And part of that, I think, is some kind of support that or encouragement that public encouragement that you're giving to people at the top to basically say, these are the people that we want you to emulate. But also with Y Combinator, what we see is that people also sort of get to work alone. And I find it very interesting that there isn't like a classroom, like they very consciously don't have a co-working space. So a lot of startup studios, what they do is they say, we're going to rent out a big space and all these desks next to each other, and then we're going to get every single person to work. The problem is then companies don't have a culture and you become at risk to that fall to the bottom syndrome. What Y Combinator says is we are going to pay for you and your co-founders to sort of get an apartment, you'll work at home, and then once a week we will come together so that we can still get that group dynamic but also be solo. And I think that it hits at some kinds of schooling help to learn solo, and if you are self-motivated then you can learn those things on your own, whereas other kinds require more of a group effort. And my general point there is that no matter what you do, you want to make sure that people rise to the top instead of fall to the bottom.
Which kind of made me think of summer camp. In summer camp, we came together every day for an hour and a half for 5 days. And in that hour and a half, many things happened, right? So at times, I was kind of like presenting what each kid was going to be doing in terms of the general theme. And then they had independent work time where we would just play music and each kid was working, at their workspace, but we could see everyone. If you had questions, we could go in breakout groups. You could throw them in the chat. And then it came the time where we would put the kids into breakout groups to actually share their projects, their ideas, where they were stuck, and they would help each other. But then they could come back and keep working independently. And then they had, for those that, like you said, were, encouraged to keep working on their own, at the end of the day, they had the rest of the afternoon to keep working on their project if that's what they wanted. And so it's like providing, it's finding the balance between the right amount of teamwork and, group work and the right amount of independent work. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts because starting a startup has traditionally been like a lonely business, right? And one of the things that Y Combinator does is that, you have literally like 2,000 people who come to your aid if you ask. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that, on having that community and that collaboration, considering what you just said about that balance.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind here. So this is something that we've thought about in Rite of Passage, is having alumni mentors. So bringing people in who we think are doing a really good job, who could set the culture. Like, culture is this very amorphous thing, but it is definitely true that at certain times and moments in history, just incredible things happen. Like parts of Vienna where Freud and Gustav Klimt, and so from psychology to art, there were all of these advancements. Then very famously, the Scottish Enlightenment with people like David Hume, and Edinburgh was like a very small town of like 40,000 people, and all of these amazing people came out of that space and time. And I think that there's a similar kind of enlightenment that happened in Silicon Valley, of like a whole new way of thinking that began to emerge, new ways of looking at the world. But also, so from there, we can just assume that culture matters. And culture is set by a very small number of people because humans are such copiers. And when you raise somebody up, people end up copying those people so that they can be more like them. You sort of get what you reward. And so what I find is with our alumni mentors and Rite of Passage, what I've wanted to do is have 6 to 8 different mentors per cohort and have them be the examples so that everyone can look at them. Because what's interesting is, say that you have people like Sam Altman, who was president of Y Combinator, Paul Graham, who founded it, and then people who have gone through Y Combinator, like the founders of Dropbox, billion-dollar company, founders of Airbnb, billion-dollar company, founders of Stripe, billion-dollar company. A lot of times, those people are people that everybody looks up to, but almost in an aspirational sense, that they are somebody else in a different chapter of their life, maybe even volume 2, volume 3 of the book that I'm writing, the story of our lives. But what Y Combinator also does is it does a good job of connecting people who are at the same moment in time or just a little bit ahead as them. So the analogy that I could put to this is I admire Jeff Bezos, absolutely. But Jeff Bezos doesn't have nearly as much to tell me about how to build an online education business as, for example, the woman who was just executive director of Alt MBA, or Marie Forleo, who was at the cutting edge of building an online education business. Those are the kinds of people who could tell me what to do. And so when you look for inspiration, you look for people who are way ahead of you. But when you look for tactical advice and wisdom, you look for people who are just a couple stones ahead of you on the path.
Yeah, and I was actually reading about this. So there's a really good article by Jessica Livingston, who's like one of the co-founders and partners at Y-Combinator. And she was talking about how her co-founders, Paul and Robert and Trevor, and how they're all amazing at judging like technical ideas. But when it comes to judging character, then that's her department. And that her role has been like kind of like the social radar in,
wow.
Y-Combinator. Yeah, and it's so, I'll send it to you. It's a really good article, and he talks about how she's really the behind the scenes person who has taken upon her to create the culture and make sure that people there feel like you said, they don't have a place where everyone goes, but that they feel that sense of community and that sense of culture. And it was just really interesting because every team player plays a different role, and she was able to create this really good environment that's really productive.
Did you get a sense of what she was focused on in particular?
Yeah.
Like, what did she sort of figure out that she adapted and applied to the Y-Combinator culture?
So she talked a lot about how they made this dinners, and at the dinners, at the beginning when they were not so big, they would treat everyone like family. So they would really like share stories and talk, and just it felt very homey, and like everyone belonged to a family. And this created a very like intimate and cheery and supportive and energizing environment. And there's a really good quote by Patrick Collison, which I don't have with me right now, but he talked about how this is one of the things that the first thing that comes up to mind when he thinks of Y-Combinator is that environment, that, like cheery and intimate and energizing environment. And it's in big part because of Jessica that really focused on that. I'll send you the article, but definitely that's a big thing, especially because they don't have like a campus or somewhere, like you were saying, like where everyone goes. And she also talks about why there's a reason for that. It's because every startup has their own, culture and their own flair. So if you put them all in one place, then they will start kind of like deviating from that. The idea is that they form their own culture in their own way, their own space. So that was also really interesting. Yeah,
sort of final point here. I think that this gets into something that I really admire about their education style. It isn't, in some ways, it is, these are the best practices. Why don't you embrace them and adopt them? But it isn't about conformity. It is about embracing those best practices while also getting into the things that make you different, the things that make you unique, and doubling down on those, because a startup itself is about an original perspective on the world and a bold, definite vision of something that should exist that doesn't, about a problem that can be solved and your unique view on how to solve that problem. And I wish that school was more about cultivating an original personality and making you more of you instead of making you feel bad for who you are and trying to dilute students to just be conformists.
And that starts by giving kids the space, the time, and the support, and the right community to explore the problems that they care about, dig into their interest, and finally start talking about the things that they like to do and dig into that, and then come up, pay attention to those ideas that they're talking about, because they have so many ideas and adults put those limitations, but they have great ideas. So that's where it starts, and that's our vision. That's what you and I are trying to do. So I think this was a great example of the adult version of what we're trying to create.
Then we can go make some Terracotta Warriors.
No, I want to go and find the real ones.
Let's go on a treasure hunt.
Great chat, David.
Well, we would appreciate if you comment on the video and subscribe. We'll be doing this every single week, and we'll try to get back to as many of your comments as possible. Now let's dance.
Yay!
Let's dance.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not excited about the finish, but